Hello and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn, and I'm very excited today for this interview. I think it's going to be another epic interview. It is December 2nd, 2015, and it's 2:51 p.m. in the afternoon, and I am interviewing Daniel Miller, and he is joined, if you're watching us on video, he is joined by his lovely wife, AnnaMarie Emfield Miller. And Daniel has a really cool story. Daniel worked for the LDS Church from 2011 to 2013 as a program manager in the Publishing Services Department. He oversaw all media production for Seminary and Institute, or as he describes it, the CES portfolio, including broadcasts. So this is a guy who had an inside view of the workings of LDS Church headquarters for a couple years. And he came out on the internet he sort of did an Ask Me Anything on the Reddit ex-Mormon forum, which is where I learned about him. And a lot of people said, you need to do a Mormon Stories interview. And so we connected up, and he said he'd be willing, which I think is really courageous and cool. But at the outset, I just want to begin by speaking about intention. I will just say personally, I've read over Daniel's outline of what he wants to talk about. I don't think that he's interested in slamming the church, of trashing the church, of just sort of focusing on the negative. I think that he just feels like it was an interesting experience. He learned a lot. He saw things that deserved respect and things that were a little bit troubling. But most importantly, at least as far as I'm concerned, my intent is simply that, people give billions of dollars a year to the LDS Church, and there isn't a ton of transparency. And so the extent to which people are willing to talk about their experiences just provide some transparency into how their money gets spent and kind of what the goings-ons are at church headquarters. So that's my intent. Happy to be as objective as possible in talking about the good, the bad, the neutral, and it'll be hopefully just really fascinating. Now, Daniel, really quick. Well, first, AnnaMarie, welcome to Mormon Stories.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And Daniel, also welcome to you.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And why don't you also just speak briefly about your intent, what you do and don't want to accomplish, just so that we can keep things as constructive as possible.
Okay. Is from me or from her?
From you.
For you, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, like you said, I had some unique experiences and had talked to several friends of mine who said, oh, you should post your story, your experience on Reddit. It's really interesting. And I didn't really understand why it was interesting for the most part, because I lived the experience, right? And my life is not really that exciting. And I just want people to know I'm not coming on here to drop any big bombshells, like I have some great inside information or anything like that. I'm really just a guy who, worked for the church, and I did see some of the interworkings of the church, which were very interesting. And I actually really enjoyed my time working at the church. I loved working there at the time that I was there. Unfortunately, I saw some things while I was there that were troubling to me, and at the same time was kind of going through some questioning of my faith, and it led me eventually out of the church. But ultimately, I don't fault the church for anything. If I hadn't been a member of the church, I never would have met my wife, would have had the family and the life that we have, and I'm thankful for that past experience. And I also understand that there are people who are still in the church that are close friends and family and so on and so forth of ours. And we love you for it. We understand why you're still there, and we get it, and we support you. And I'm not here to try to persuade anybody to leave, that the church is some wicked organization that's trying to do anything, other than be a good organization. And for me and for, the experiences that I had, it didn't seem to work. And there's some specific reasons why that I think I'll share on here. And just, I want people to respect me for that. If you're still a true believer listening, understand that it didn't work for me, and there's some reasons why, and I'll support you as much as you support me.
Excellent. All right. And I should say that AnnaMarie is being a mom during this time period. She's got kids coming home soon, so she may jump in and out of the interview. And mostly, I think, AnnaMarie, you're here to kind of support your husband. Is that? Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yep.
Well, feel free to jump in anytime. All right. So, Daniel, let's just begin. Let's talk about your history growing up.
Okay. Yeah, so I grew up in Rigby, Idaho, and born and raised in the church. I have a brother and 2 sisters, and we were very active growing up. I enjoyed playing sports and very athletic and competitive in the things that I did. I think that I was quite a troublemaker. If you ask my friends, neighbors, and parents and siblings, that I was kind of that third child that wanted all the attention and, was always trying to one up everybody else. But, one of the things that really stands out about my childhood was that because I was so competitive and kind of wanted to make my own name for myself, that I was not somebody that was very open to be controlled. That my parents, as hard as they tried to discipline me, I think, had a rough time trying to keep me in line with me always trying to just do whatever it was that I wanted to do. And I definitely, probably just a typical kid, you wake up in the morning on Sunday mornings and your parents tell you it's time to go to church. And I went and kind of did my thing. And like any other kid, probably had a lot of times where, you go to sacrament meeting and then a couple of the guys decide to skip out the rest and go up to Maverick and grab some hot dogs and, hang out for a couple hours and drink your Maverick mugs, those big Maverick mugs that they used to have, and then hurry and make it back to church in time so that you could be there to ride home with your parents, and at the dinner table trying to come up with what you learned, and the typical growing up Mormon. And
in Idaho.
In Idaho, yep, that was what we did. Went to seminary, graduated from seminary. I do remember as a teenager there was some struggles that I had in terms of just not feeling like I fit in with the quote unquote cookie cutter mold that Mormonism tries to teach you to be as a priesthood holder, the look, the behavior, all those things. And it wasn't like I necessarily was doing anything that was over the top or completely outrageous. But it was just, I just didn't really feel like I fit in. And for whatever reason, my personality type took to the programs of the church in such a way that I just didn't really feel like I was ever worthy enough. Like I was good enough. Like no matter how hard I tried, I would always fall short. And it was a constant worry for me, feeling like, in fact, I remember right after I was baptized, feeling like I'm washed clean. And I remember I don't even remember what it was, but I remember the first time I thought, oh, I sinned. And now, I'm not clean like I was anymore right after I got baptized, and how guilty I felt about that. And realizing that now I need to go repent and pray and ask for forgiveness. And it just seemed like a constant battle where I was never good enough. I always had to try to do better, and a lot of the mistakes and the not wanting to be controlled, I think, played a big part of that I don't do it just because you tell me to do it type person. And in fact, if you tell me to do it, a lot of times I would have just done the opposite just to prove to you that I could do that. And she's laughing at me over here because she knows that.
Is he still that way, AnnaMarie?
Yes, he's still that way.
And so, yeah, I really just kind of wanted to march to the beat of my own drum. And it was torn with a lot of guilt. And I think that compounded a little bit for me when they did the whole raising of the bar, and I'm thinking, man, I don't feel like I'm worthy enough now and everything that I'm supposed to do. And you see all your friends that are priesthood leaders and, teachers quorum, deacons quorum, whatever, advisor or not advisors, the presidents and the counselors and whatnot. And I don't really think that I ever participated in any of those because I just was maybe a little bit too fringe in a lot of areas. And never really participated there. And quite honestly, don't know that I really ever wanted to, because the commitment and the requirements to be there, I enjoyed my freedom and didn't like to be tied down to a lot of those types of things. So when the whole raising of the bar thing came, I think that for myself, I really had to find a way, because as I've researched over the past couple of years, there were a lot of people who went through those same types of experiences that would literally decide they couldn't deal with it and kill themselves. I don't know what the rate of suicide is in teens in Mormonism, but I was one of those that was really struggling with that guilt. And when you are a teenager going through those self-esteem issues and feeling like you're not good enough and nobody loves you because you can't be this person, and a lot of people I've talked to about that have said, I don't know what you're talking about because I never experienced that. I've never felt that. I don't see that. But for me, that was my experience with growing up Mormon, was that there was just a lot of guilt associated with being a Mormon and never feeling like you're good enough. And, I've had people tell me, well, that's because you don't understand the atonement and how it works. And maybe not, I guess. I don't know. But for me, I felt like I was as in as anybody could be, but the guilt always remained. And later on in life, as you grow up and, become a parent, a husband, and you've got all these things that you're supposed to do, the constant worry of continuing to be worthy for the next baby blessing or the next baptism or the next whatever, it was just like, or I got to have the Spirit with me when I go home teaching or whatever it is. It just was always a constant thing that for me, in order for me to cope with that as a youth, and probably 17 age, maybe, probably 17 would be a close estimate, I had to learn to kind of shut off the feeling of guilt, because it was such a constant thing in my life that, it would just end up doing damage or ultimately, lead to suicide. And that's, I think, had an impact on me throughout the rest of my life, because as you're still Mormon, you continue down that cycle of guilt throughout your whole life with all the things that I just mentioned there. And it's hard. For a very long time in our marriage, I think it was really hard for me to say I was sorry, because when you can bottle that guilt up inside of you so far that you don't feel remorse, then you don't really ever apologize when you make mistakes, because you're not really sorry for that. And if I would do something that was hurtful to her, I was able to just shrug it off. Like, why is that a big deal to you? It's not a big deal to me. But that goes back to that early on in my life, having to just shut that guilt down so that I could function and be a person. And unfortunately, there's some negative side effects with not being able to fully, feel remorse for some of the things that you do or whatnot. So, looking back now, I recognize that, but back then I didn't realize it. It was just, survival mode as far as, I look back now, and it wasn't that I made any conscious decisions to do that. It was just, it was the choice that I made. So I kind of grew up in that frame of mind. I remember when the mission call came, or the time to go on a mission came, and I was extremely filled with anxiety over that. In fact, I remember all growing up telling my family, my parents, that I don't want to go on a mission. And they're, oh yeah, you do. You want to go. You're just saying that now, but you'll want to go. And no, I never wanted to go. Even right up to the day I left, I really didn't want to go. But when you grow up in Rigby, Idaho, and all your friends are going on missions, and the expectation is there, and back then it was a commandment of the Lord that every worthy, willing, and able person does go on a mission, and I felt like it was part of my salvational requirements. And if I didn't go on a mission, that somehow I was breaking commandments that was going to put my salvation at risk. And so preparing for that, I had a lot of angst about going out of the country. I definitely didn't want to go foreign. I felt like being at least in the United States, I was somewhat close to home and wouldn't feel so homesick. And along with that, I loved my family. Growing up, I didn't spend a lot of time with friends outside of my house and going to, the get-togethers and all the social activities and things like that. I had a couple of really close friends with that we either hung out at my house or their house. But quite honestly, on the weekends, if I had the choice, I would have spent it with my family. So that played into the fact of now I have to leave my family for 2 years and I can't talk to them. And that was a real hard thing for me to try to accept, that I'm going to be so homesick because I hadn't spent more than a couple nights away from them ever in my life. And now I'm gone for 2 years. So I go through the process, and I remember, my brother sharing experiences with me about his mission and how great it was, and he loved his mission and that I'll do good. And he was kind of like that at first, but eventually you overcome that, and everything is fine and you'll love your mission. And had a few friends, a couple of my brother's other friends also had kind of taken me out on little drives in their car and chatted with me about their missions and kind of given me encouragement. And so I didn't really feel pressure from my parents. I mean, I just kind of felt the general Mormon pressure that this is what you do. I don't recall ever being told you will go on a mission. It was just kind of what you do, in Rigby, Idaho. If I didn't go, what else would I be doing? All my friends would be gone. I'd be by myself. And so I guess I'll do it.
So where were you called?
So, yeah, I went to the Japan Tokyo North Mission. And I remember going into the MTC, and I'm probably a little bit embarrassed to admit this, but I had never read the Book of Mormon cover to cover. I remember going into classes and going over the first discussion that we learned, and they're talking about this guy, Joseph Smith. And I'm like, who's Joseph Smith? And I grew up Mormon, going to church and doing all these things.
That's crazy.
I had no clue who Joseph Smith was.
So in all your time in Rigby, Idaho, going to church, I guess you spent more time at Maverick than at church.
Yeah, probably. We didn't really do a ton of family home evenings and go over. We would kind of get on a kick here and there, and it would be more of, loving your neighbor and loving your family and being a good person. But it was never really gospel oriented or doctrine oriented.
Did you say you graduated from seminary?
Yeah.
And you never heard about Joseph Smith?
And I have to admit, I did slough seminary quite frequently. And I think the guidelines back then for graduation were much more lenient now in 1992 than they are today for attendance and whatnot. So I feel really embarrassed about admitting.
That's all right. No, that's interesting. That's really interesting. So MTC. Yeah,
so I get into the MTC and learning about Joseph Smith. Wow, this is really cool. And I really felt strongly about, that scripture that talks about how great shall be your joy if you save one soul. And I really felt like, well, that soul's kind of mine, because I'm just now being converted and really learning about the church and what it's all about. And so I guess I'm that first person. And yeah, how great shall be my joy now that I'm receiving, the true church and the truth and being able to go to the celestial kingdom. So yeah, for myself, I'll experience that joy. And now as a missionary, I get to go, having been newly converted, basically, I'm kind of excited about it in some aspects, and I get to go share my testimony with others. So that worked out well. One thing that stood out to me in the MTC was, I remember in my district, my companion and a couple others, we were looking through the Book of Mormon at the facsimiles, or in the Book of Abraham, the facsimiles, and facsimile 2, the circular one there that has all the stuff. And we had heard that there's a lot of temple stuff that's really buried inside of there, and we were really trying to study that and understand it, and like, oh, this is going to reveal some great mysteries. And but then I remember as we were studying some of those things, we all kind of got this really ominous feeling, like we're seeing stuff in there that's somewhat related to the temple, and we really felt like the adversary was there strongly, and we were doing something that we weren't supposed to, because we were looking at temple stuff outside of the temple, and this really negative, dark, ominous feeling that we were perceiving over ourselves. And we closed our Book of Mormons, our scriptures, and we ran back to our rooms, from, I don't even remember where we were studying, one of the classrooms or whatnot. And that feeling, that impression, like, oh, the adversary is really there and he's real. And I look back at that now and think there's probably a lot of cognitive dissonance that, was associated with that now. But back then, that was kind of an impactful thing that really kind of made me have an experience with what the adversary in Mormon terms must really be like. And in a way was a testimony builder that, oh yeah, it's true, because the adversary's here, he's real, he's trying to tempt me, or he's trying to tear me down, or whatever the case was, and kind of solidified it a little bit in my head at that point. So graduated from the MTC or whatever, got done with the MTC and was sent out to Tokyo North, and hugest culture shock, second hugest culture shock probably of my life. You walk off the airplane and jump in a van there with the mission president and the APs, and they drive you to the mission home. And I remember sitting in the van looking out the windows, and billboards, first of all, concrete as far as you can see. And they say in Japan, where it was at one time one of the largest, or the largest city in the world, that if you start on one end of the city of Tokyo and you walk as far as you can see to the horizon, and you do that 6 times, you'll be to the other end of the city. Wow. So we're talking huge, like from Rigby, Idaho to Tokyo, Japan, in the size of the concrete jungle that you're in, number one. But number two, looking at these billboards and realizing there isn't one word of English anywhere. And in train stations, not one word of English. And nobody, as much as the Japanese people back then, maybe it's different now, but back then thought they could speak English, they very broken and couldn't understand anything. Trying to communicate was very tough. But I just remember that initial culture shock, like, what did I just get myself into? And just pleading with God to please don't let me get separated from my companion, because I won't even know how to call on the telephone, or who to call, or where to go. And just completely scared, like literally just physically shaking. I was so scared at the time. And so that was definitely a very defining moment for me. I do remember for probably the first 3 months, because I wasn't able to communicate, that I kind of really wanted to share the gospel, but I just felt like I'm homesick, number one. I can't speak the language, number two. And now I'm in the thick of it. I've got 2 years to go. I'm not really sure that this is what I want to do. It's hard, and I remember crying myself to sleep. And my mom, after my mission and in subsequent years would, laugh about the letters. Yeah, you would write these horrible letters about how sad you were and how much you hated it and how much you wanted to come home. And we would just ignore it and write you letters back of encouragement and hope you're doing well. And eventually all that changed. But I do remember those first several months, very traumatic for me in that instance. And I was put in an apartment where the people that were in there, my companion and one of the other people that were the other missionaries that were there, were both Japanese. And my companion actually spoke really good Japanese, really good English. But because he was my trainer, he never told me the entire time he was my companion. He never spoke English to me one time. So two of the people there were Japanese, myself, and then the other person that was there, the other missionary that was there, were American. But for the most part, I got thrown in right out of the gate into spending the majority of my time with the Japanese people, learning the Japanese language. And subsequent companions from there, the high majority of all of them were Japanese natives and didn't speak much English at all. There were times that I would go, a month until he go to his own conference without speaking any English at all. So I really did learn the Japanese language very well. Toward the end of my mission, when members or investigators would call and I would answer the phone, they couldn't tell whether I was the American or the Japanese in the apartment. And, I always kind of felt like that was a badge of honor that I was able to fool even the Japanese that I was actually, I wasn't the gaijin, they called it, with the funny accent. And a few people nicknamed me Watanabe as my Japanese name because I sounded very Japanese. So I really dove in and tried, I guess is the thing, that I really tried to learn the language and tried to do my best to be able to share the gospel while I was there.
Would you remember enough Japanese to give us a sample of what your testimony would have sounded like in Japanese?
Oh, geez. Yeah, maybe.
Go for it.
私はダニエル・ミラーです。イエス・キリストは私の大好きです。I'm really nervous about speaking Japanese. I don't know why.
No, it's all right. It's all right.
I mean, it's been, 20-something years?
No, that's fun. I just wanted to do it a little bit.
We had a couple of Japanese exchange students that we've brought that have stayed with us a little bit since, and I speak a little Japanese here and there, but for the most part, I really don't get to use it.
It gets rusty. It gets rusty. Yeah. Okay. Anything else about your mission before we talk about what came next?
Maybe one story that I do remember, I really got kind of passionate toward the end in being zone leader and the callings that I had there. And I remember that there was one missionary that was there during a zone conference and got a lot of reports that he's just kind of acting out, goofing off and staying out past curfew and going into areas that he wasn't supposed to. And I remember just very passionately kind of taking him aside, and he was kind of belligerent during the zone conference and whatnot, and taking him aside and just saying, you know what, I've spent nearly 2 years of my life out here building up the kingdom of God and serving these people and loving them. And it's very offensive to me that in one short action, you can ruin the entire 2 years that I've put forth, as well as all the other people here to give the church the name that we've worked so hard to give it, and think about those types of things. And, so I was very, very defensive, I guess, and maybe a little bit, definitely probably a little bit self-righteous, in the sense that I've worked hard for this, and, why aren't you giving your best while you're here? And so I definitely changed from not wanting to be there to, I love it, I don't want to go home. One of the and I'll just maybe share a couple of experiences. One of the experiences when I was first baptism I had, we knocked on the door of a guy who had been reading the Bible, and years ago he learned about tithing, and he felt like, if the one true church, or the church that I'm going to join, is a church that has tithing. And so he had been saving tithing for nearly 2 years since he read that in the Bible. And we knocked on his door one day and talked to him for a couple minutes. And the first thing he asked is, do you have tithing? And we said yes. And so we went in. He was baptized, paid all of his back tithing from before he was even a member for like 1.5 years. So that was a big spiritual experience for me, thinking, God led us to him. And toward the end of my mission, I actually got to go. He was called as a branch president, and I went through the temple with him. And I remember standing in the celestial room with him, giving him this hug and just holding him in there, and him telling me thank you. And, how it was a very spiritual, very powerful experience standing there with this guy that I had baptized and seeing his progress, I guess, in the gospel. And I had another experience where I met a younger kid, probably 17, and it was just one of these feelings that when I met him, it was like I knew you in the pre-existence type feeling, that we were friends long before. And then you start going through the scenarios. It must have been that I said that I would find you and bring you the gospel, and he felt a lot the same way. We just clicked, you know what I mean? We just felt instantly, we just bonded. We were really close friends, and it may not necessarily have been that we were actually friends in the pre-existence. It may just have been that we clicked and we were really good friends, or whatever the case is, right? So he was baptized. Since I know he went on a mission, baptized quite a few other Japanese people, friends of his, and was very successful in converting people. But I think probably the most powerful experience for me on my mission was I met a Brazilian girl about halfway through my mission who had come to Japan to work in the factories. And what they do is they come over, and Japan pays you so well that they earn the money and then they send the money back home to their families. And so she had just arrived to Japan, and what we used to do in Japan is we would teach free English classes once a week. And so we'd go to the train station and we would hand out the little, we call chirashis, is what we call, little pamphlets that had the date, time, location, all that stuff. And so she showed up, or well, actually what happened was she found one of those pamphlets on the ground and she picked it up and she called the number. It was our apartment. And I answered, and she asked all the details, and she was speaking kind of broken English and whatnot, didn't know any Japanese. And I gave her all the information. So that next week, she comes in to the church, and I'm sitting down and kind of working with my class. She came in late, and I'm working with whatever class I was assigned to. And she walked in, and I remember her looking at me as she turned the corner to walk in, and her eyes just about popped out of her head. And then she started getting tears welling up in her eyes, and then she walked out of the room and went into one of the other rooms, and a couple of the other missionaries went over and were talking to her, and she said, "I want to talk to that guy," and she was pointing at me or whatever. So I switched with one of the other elders, and they took over my class, and I went back and I sat and I was talking with her. And so she told me of an experience just a couple of weeks before coming to Japan where she had a dream, and she was looking over the earth and wondering what the purpose of life is and what it's all about and why we're here and so on and so forth. And she said that a man in white robes walked up to her and said that, "I have a plan for you, and that you'll find these things out and be patient," and blah, blah, blah. And so then she looks back over the earth, and she's just feeling really good and excited for her new path and whatever. And she turns back to the man, and he's gone. And so she goes looking for him, and she can't find him. Well, off in the distance, she sees a person. So she goes toward that person, and she said that she got up to that person and saw a face and didn't recognize him. So she said the first face she knows was the Savior. She knows it was Jesus. But then that second face she saw, she said that it was me. And so a couple weeks later, she comes to Japan, and here she is, we meet, and 2 weeks later, after meeting her, she's baptized. And I guess I should preface that this was in November, and we had been praying for what the mission did as a Christmas miracle, is what they called it, that we wanted to have one baptism in November and one in December. And so my companion and I, what we did at the beginning of November is we did what we called covenant dendo, or covenant proselyting, basically. So we covenanted with God that we would start sacrificing our mornings and our lunch breaks and all these other things. And instead of doing those things, we would focus on finding people to teach. And so when we found this girl, we really felt like, okay, the Lord's blessing us, and we're holding up our end and he's holding up our end, and this really great, super powerful experience. Well, then in December, this girl's sister gets baptized. And so now we've hit our goal for November, and we've hit our goal for December. Super awesome experience. Well, toward the end of my mission, I was able to go back to that area after I had been transferred out. And there was, I don't remember the exact number, over 100 Brazilian people who had been baptized since then. And they had enough, they were saying, or close to enough to start a Brazilian branch in that area. They had all the headsets there. They'd go because the services were in Japanese. So the people who didn't speak Japanese, they had translators there that were doing all that stuff. And my wife and I went back to Japan, 10 years after my mission? Mm-hmm. and they still had Brazilian people showing up there. So, I don't know how many people that ended up converting, but enough there. And then, you look at how many people went home to Brazil and took the gospel to those people in Brazil, and so on and so forth, and whether that's still going on or not, I don't know. But that was the thing to me, that it was like, oh, you know what, I'm so glad I came. I was called to this area by revelation, just a really super powerful experience. And which is why when I found out how they actually assign missionaries based off of the computer generated format that they use now, I was a little shocked at that. But anyway, super powerful experience, one of the best of my mission. And I remember on the plane ride home, just stopping in Salt Lake City on my way to Idaho Falls and calling my mom and saying, I don't want to come home. I want to go back. And she was in tears. Why would you not want to come home and see your family? And I just wanted to go back, and she didn't understand. And so the second biggest culture shock was when I came home and went back to Rigby, Idaho, and saw that these roads, why do you need such wide roads? It was just so foreign to me. So
wasteful.
Yeah, it really was. And just seeing the mountains and the sunsets and the potato fields that are out there. So that was probably more of a culture shock and trying to adjust. I remember sitting down at the counter the first morning I'm home and opening up my little blue planner that they gave you, when you're on your mission, and saying, okay, well, who can I serve today? What can I do? And I sat there for probably 15 minutes, and I'm like, I got nothing. There's nobody that everybody's Mormon here. What do you do? And sitting down on the couch and just feeling like it's so wasteful to be here watching TV, and there's got to be something that I can do to spread the gospel or do better than this. I just can't resign myself to such a wasteful life and not being about my Father's work or whatever it was. So
you were kind of hot. You were a little bit hot and cold, weren't you?
I was, yeah. And, my parents, I think, were a little irritated at me because my mom would be like, hey, can you run up and drop this off at the post office for me? And I would be like, alone? I can't, I don't have a companion. I can't go alone. And every time we would drive somewhere in the car, we would have to say a prayer, and, just very, very living the rules, which is so not like me. For me to be a rebellious child and then come home and just get up in the morning and still do my PPP and all the things I was supposed to be doing, for my mission it didn't last long. I mean, don't get me wrong, but I still wanted to try to keep that focus, and that was what my mission did. And I had a lot of fun. I realize now some of the things that you go through to help indoctrinate you into the being excited about the work and whatnot, but it definitely worked for me. I loved my mission. I had a great time.
Excellent. So you come home and you go to Rick's College, right?
I did. Yep. Went to Rick's College. I was working in a jewelry store in Idaho Falls. Jensen Jewelers was the name of the jewelry store, full time, and going to school kind of part time. And I met my wife there at Rick's.
Now, AnnaMarie, do you want to tell us a bit about yourself, or do you want to not tell us anything about yourself?
Oh, that's fine. What do you want to know?
Just a little bit about your background.
So I grew up actually in southern Utah, not too far south, and I lived there until I was 16. So I have 5 siblings. There's 6 kids in my family, and I am number 2. I'm the oldest daughter. And my family's always been very active, and I was like the opposite of Dan. I don't have a rebellious bone in my body. So following the rules was always very easy for me, very comfortable for me. I did not feel stifled in any way whatsoever with that kind of a life. I liked the security, and I liked to have a plan for my entire life and know what was next. So definitely a different kind of experience than he had. And let's see, so we lived there until I was 16, and then we moved to Idaho and to Rigby, but I didn't meet Daniel. He's 5 years older than me. So by the time I was 16, he was already finishing up his mission. And so I did not know him, even though we graduated from the same high school. And then I had my last 2 years of high school in Idaho. And I went to Rick's right after that. I had my plan and I was not going to deviate from that. Like I said, I have, very different kind of perspective, and my experience in the church growing up was very different from his experience in the church growing up. So
in what way?
I always felt that I always felt like I had freedom. My parents went every single Sunday, no matter what, but it was always, they got up, they got ready for church and invited us to go with them. But we were free to stay home if we so chose.
Wow, that's
we
cool.
didn't really do that very often.
Yeah.
But we were free to do that. And there wasn't even like a guilt trip involved of that's where we should be or anything. Genuinely, it was our choice. So I didn't feel any sort of like I did it because I had to, or that I was guilted into it, or anything like that. I'm the type of person definitely that's kind of a nurturing person. I want to take care of those around me. And so I think that I have always had a little bit of, I didn't want to disappoint my parents, but they did not ever put any pressure on me that way, or that what they expected of me. It was just more what I expected of myself. So his experience and my experience were different, I think, just because our personalities are so different.
And it sounds like you didn't have the guilt and shame.
None of it. No, and it's different, I think, for a priesthood holder too. And there's no expectation as a female that I would be going on a mission. That was more of a choice, not a commandment or whatever. So I think, there's definitely a different level of pressure on maybe for him than there was for me.
Cool.
Yeah, it's a little bit different.
I will say about our dad too that I love is he is a guy who lives the teach him correct principles and let them govern themselves. And he spends the time teaching the things that he believes is right and allows you to make those choices and will love you regardless of what those choices are. And it's been something that I as a parent, definitely have always wanted to, with my kids, try to model after in that respect as well.
That sounds great.
And, maybe for me, I think it maybe one thing more about my childhood, it was a little difficult, I think, for my mom, because my dad worked out of town construction for over 20 years, and he would leave on Sundays. And he would be gone the entire week, and he would come home Friday nights. And then Saturday morning early, he would get up and he would go to his office, corporate office there, where he would do the time cards for his employees, and he would get the supplies that he needed. And he spent most all day Saturday preparing to hit the road again on Sunday. And so I didn't get to spend a ton of time with my dad growing up, and maybe that was why my mom was kind of trying to do a lot of the raising her own, and maybe why I was a little more wild and felt like I was free. But I do remember when Dad came home, if I was bad the week before, I was going to hear about it. Dad was a little, Mom was very authority figure because she had to be, but she was also very nurturing. And I remember, Dad coming home, and he had the personality very competitive. I think half the scars or more that I have on my body is playing basketball with my dad and getting in fights and fouling each other. And, so since then, he's been a huge influence in my life. Once that he was able to finally come and work in town and come home every night, our relationship grew, because he and I are so much alike in so many ways that, I love spending time with my dad. And there's definitely a ton of things that I implemented for myself that I want to pattern after the way that he raised me, but also with her dad, the experience that I've had. I've never seen anybody that will unconditionally love another person as well as he does. And that's not an easy thing to do. And, for me, it's a trait that I've had to learn over time. Some people it comes much more naturally for, and I think that that's how she is, where I'm more spur of the moment and wear my emotions on my shirt sleeve sometimes. And when I'm happy, everybody's happy. When I'm angry or sad, everybody else is sad. And I'm the spontaneous, hey, let's pick up and let's go to St. George for the weekend. And she's, well, where are we going to stay? And we got to have a plan. What are we going to do? And I don't know. Let's just go. We'll find a place when we're there. And so, yeah, I think we complement each other very well in that aspect. And
so you guys met at Rick's?
Mm-hmm. So he'd been home from his mission 2 years by the time I met him, but I was just out of high school.
Okay. So you were 18?
I was 18, yeah.
Yeah.
Legal.
She was a youngster. Barely 18.
Barely, yeah.
Okay. So you guys met and?
So we met through a mutual friend who, yeah. We had had some friends in common at the time that I had been there, but we were hanging out with them at different times based on our different personalities.
Her friends were in the party scene. And
I was not.
She was not. And I was. And so there was some areas of Rick's College where it was a 24/7 party on campus dorm that, happened to have a lot of non-Mormon approved activities going on.
So we didn't overlap, even though we had some
so,
same
yeah,
friends.
I would hang out with her friends when I was out partying, and then when they weren't, they thought she was super cute, and they would hang out with her and pretend to be good guys and whatnot. And so
we ended up meeting through a mutual friend, but
so the squeaky clean missionary rubbed off.
It did, yeah. So that's one thing to point out. I had never, prior to going on my mission, tried alcohol or tobacco or anything like that even one time. I was really trying to do my best to live it, and came home and, you know what, I'm 21 now and I've never tried this and I think it would be fun and whatnot, and kind of got into that scene a little bit. And so it was a good thing she came along when she did, because I think she kind of rescued me from my addictive personality, I guess you could say. I obsess over things, which I think is part of the whole process of me exiting the church. When I did obsessing like I did from 6 to 10, 12 hours a day, sometimes just reading, I just obsessed. And so, yeah, she came along definitely to make sure that I was back on the straight and narrow.
So you guys dated how long before you were married?
3.5 months.
Wow.
Almost 4 months. We were engaged after 2, and then we were engaged for just under 2 when we got married.
Wow. And you were still 18.
I was still 18, yeah.
And you guys have been married how long?
18 years.
And how many children?
We have 5.
Okay.
We have a 1-year-old, so.
Wow.
Yeah.
A caboose, maybe.
He's 7 years younger than our next,
Definitely
so yes.
Caboose,
a caboose.
Yeah. All right. And maybe we'll jump into talking about your church employment, but there's a story about a patriarchal blessing and having a child that maybe you guys want to talk about as we wrap up talking about your personal history. Is that all right?
Yeah, you bet. So in my patriarchal blessing, and it's pretty specific, and some people can say, oh, well, it could mean the next life. But the way it's in my patriarchal blessing, it basically says that I'll be a father to sons and daughters. And in this life. Yeah, very specific.
So plural, male and female.
Yeah. And so I also do remember a time where I don't remember if you needed a blessing of comfort or if you were sick or whatnot, but
I remember that, yeah.
It was a blessing where I said that you'll be the mother of sons and daughters or something like that. And I used plural for daughters as well in that one. And, at the time she said, well, the blessing was over. You realize you said daughters and we don't have enough daughters yet to be daughters. And
we just have one daughter.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we had one daughter. So we had, going along the gap in the 7 years, we had 3 boys and 1 girl. And we were trying to decide, well, do we want to have another child? We're not sure. And we kind of waffled back and forth. And so we decided, you know what, we're going to pray about it. Patriarchal blessing says that we're supposed to. So we're going to pray about it. And I remember, at least myself, and she can speak to she can speak to it on her own, but I remember very distinctly feeling like the answer that I got to my prayers was that, yes, there is one more that's supposed to come, and that, yes, it's a girl. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, more so than any spiritual experience or any answer to any prayer that I had ever had in my life. I was as sure about that as anything. And I don't know, maybe you can speak to yours, but
I didn't have that as strong as you did.
So anyway, we go, and this is kind of at a time where I'm going through a little bit of a faith crisis and not sure of a lot of things. But so we decided to have a next baby, and just really felt like there was a daughter up there waiting, and we're excited and kind of planning for it. And we kind of both talked about it, that we're ready for it and whatnot. So we go in for the test and find out, no, it's a boy. And I mean, I was shocked. I don't know how you felt about it.
I wasn't, but
I was, but you were. I don't think she was shocked that it was a boy, but I know that her and my daughter were kind of sad because they were so sure that, or I don't know, so wanting a girl, I guess, at first. But I know for me, I was shocked just because I had prayed about this and my patriarchal blessing said it. And how could it be anything other than that? I don't understand. And how do I reconcile that? And there are times where you can think that you should have a prayer answered, or you can find a way as a Mormon to rationalize away or justify away the reason why, or it's not in God's plan, or I'll know later. But to me, I knew that was our last child, and it wasn't what was supposed to happen. So I was pretty traumatized over that, and not because we had a boy. Obviously, I love our son and wouldn't trade him for anything, but just because I felt like God specifically told me this is a girl. And, I know people will say, oh, well, that's because you were doubting and maybe you weren't living the way you were supposed to. And so you lost the blessings of your patriarchal blessing. And, my rebuttal to that is, how does that make my son feel, knowing that we were cursed with the boy, that we were supposed to have a girl? And that's the answer, is now God's going to show me by giving me a boy that I lost my blessings. And what does that make my son? I mean, that's not a legitimate answer to the concerns that I wasn't living righteously, so I was not receiving the blessings I was supposed to.
But it sounds like an even bigger part of that was just you feeling like God had told you it would be a girl, and it didn't happen. So that made you think or feel what?
Like, and at that time too, I was kind of questioning some things, which we'll talk about later. But it just made me feel like, okay, well, if this wasn't God talking to me and answering my prayers or telling me His will for me, then what about all the other experiences? Can I really, at this point, put all these experiences with other times and these dreams that people had where they saw me in dreams, and baptisms, and the times I felt guided by the Spirit, and all these other things, is that all just made up in my head? What's the reality here? What's really the answer to a prayer, and what's not the answer to a prayer? And what's made up in my mind, and what's actually God talking to me? And does God even care? Does He really play that much of a role in my life?
Sure.
We can talk about that later.
No, it's good. Okay, so if that feels right to you, what we could do is we can end this episode as being sort of episode 1, talking about your background, and we'll start the next episode talking about your time at the church. How does that sound?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. Well, listeners, thanks for joining us for episode 1 of this interview with Daniel Miller, former LDS Church employee. And we look forward to interviewing Daniel more about his time with the church next episode. So thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you guys very soon. Thanks, Daniel.
Yep, thank you.